Namaste. We carry forward our discussion on physical geography in the Indian context, and in this lecture, we shall explore the climate and habitats of India. Now, we have seen before that climate is a broad composite of the average conditions of a region measured in terms of such things as temperature, amount of rainfall or snowfall, snow and ice cover, and winds. So, when we talk about the climate of India, we are asking what are the average conditions in India in different months? What is the temperature in different months? What is the amount of rainfall or snowfall in different months? What is the snow and ice cover in different months? What are the wind speeds and directions like in different months? And in this context, it is important to understand that the climate of India has got a lot to do with the location of India and with the geography of India. Now, we observed in the last lecture that India is located in the southeastern portion of Asia. We are to the north of the Indian Ocean. And when we consider the peninsular portion of India, it is covered by oceans on all three sides. On the west, we have the Arabian Sea. On the south, we have the Indian Ocean. And towards the east, we have the Bay of Bengal. Now, because the peninsular portion is surrounded by waters on all three sides, so the climate of the southern portion of India, the peninsular portion of India, is more or less equitable. So it does not become very hot, it does not become very cold, especially in the coastal areas. We have also observed in a previous lecture that near the coast we have the sea breeze and the land breeze, which keep the temperatures equable in those areas. Now, if we move towards the north of the country, to the very north we have the mighty Himalayas, which are young fold mountains. Now, these are very tall mountains and they act as a climatic divide between India and the rest of Asia. So, essentially, if we have monsoons or winds that are moving towards the northern portions of the country, then they will be stopped by the Himalayas. The Himalayas will similarly not permit the cold winds that are coming from the north into the country. When you have the Himalayas, when the winds rise, they will result in a torrential amount of rainfall. And being very cold areas, we will get snowfall in those areas. So, that is about the north of the country. Towards the west, we have the Thar Desert, where we have the Aravalli Hills, which are located in the southwest to northeast direction. And that has also got a lot of bearing on this area receiving a less amount of rainfall. So, if we look at the conditions of climate, there are several factors that determine the climate of India. The first is the latitudinal extent. So, we saw that the southern portion of India is a tropical area and the northern portion becomes subtropical. Now, given that India is a very large country, roughly 3000 kilometers across and 3000 kilometers from north to south, it is easy to expect that different parts will be having different climates. So, India does not have a single climate, different portions will have different climates. And there is a marked difference between north to south and between west to east. Then we have the Himalayas, the climatic divide. These trap the monsoons, meaning that when we have the monsoons are not permitted to move away from the country. They are trapped in the Indian subcontinent, which results in a heavy amount of rainfall in India as compared to our neighbors. They trap the monsoons, they cause orographic rainfall, and they shield the subcontinent from the cold northern winds. Then we have the distribution of land and water. The peninsular nature moderates the climate. Distance from the sea. The greater the distance, the less is the moderating influence of the sea. And so the areas that are very near to the sea, the coastal areas, they have a very equitable climate, which is different from more continental climates that we face in the areas that are far away from the sea. Altitude. the temperature decreases with height. And so in the same season, in the same month, we can have different locations that have a very different temperature profile. Even in the peak of the summer seasons, we have a large number of hill stations that remain cold. In fact, so cold that you can even find snow cover, and you will probably need to wear warm clothes in the summer season. Then we have the relief. The Western Ghats cause heavy rainfall on their windward sides and deprive the plateau on their leeward side. So basically what we are talking about here is that when we talk about the Western Ghats, so these Western Ghats, when we have the rains, the rain bearing winds that move in this direction, then there is an intense amount of orographic rainfall on this portion. And orographic rainfall, as you'll remember, when we have a mountain and we have winds that are bearing moisture, then these winds move up with the slope of the mountain. And when they move up, here we have colder temperatures and here we have warmer temperatures, because the temperature decreases with height. And so when these winds move upwards, they form clouds, and there is an intense amount of rainfall on this side. Then when the winds descend on the other side of the mountain, they become warmer, and when they become warmer, they do not cause any rainfall in these areas, because for rainfall to occur there has to be condensation, and condensation means that you need to cool the air. Now when the air becomes warmer, you do not get any rainfall in this region. So these mountains can act as a climatic divide, a rain divide. So this portion is known as the windward side, and this portion is known as the leeward side. Now if we consider the Western Ghats, we'll find that the windward side, that is this portion, will receive intense amount of rainfall, whereas the leeward side, which is this portion, this will receive very less amount of rainfall. And you can even observe that in the case of the satellite imagery, the windward side is very green in color and the leeward side is yellowish in color, showing that there is less amount of vegetation in this portion. Similarly, we get a very good amount of orographic rainfall in the Himalayas. So when we consider the winds moving like this in this direction, so when the winds take this direction, in that case, when the winds move upwards, they cause a heavy amount of rainfall in this area. So there will be a lot of greenery in this area, lots of forests. When the winds move towards this direction, here again you have these northern hills, which will then reflect the winds back. So as the winds rise, they cause an intense amount of rainfall here, and then they are also reflected towards the Himalayas. And so in this case, we get the highest amount of rainfall here. So we have locations such as Cherrapunji and Mausinram, which receive some of the highest rainfalls in the world. Then not only we have these mountains, but we also have the Peguyoma. So these Arakan mountains and the Peguyoma, they act as another reflectors that send the monsoons back into the country. So once these rain bearing winds have entered into this area, they cannot cross to the north, they cannot cross to the east, and so they perform an intense amount of rainfall in this area. So this is very clearly evident when we observe the colors in this satellite imagery. This portion is mostly yellow and brown. This portion is whitish to yellowish, and most of India is very green, except maybe the peninsular plateau, which is lying on the leeward side, or the Thar desert. Now the Thar desert, because in this case the Aravallis are oriented in this direction, and so there is no orographic rainfall that occurs in this region. So these are the various factors that determine the climate of India. In India, we define 4 seasons. So we have the hot weather season from March to June in North India, and South India has a more equable climate, and so we do not clearly distinguish a hot weather season in South India. So from March to June, we will have situations where there will be intense amount of heating in the northern parts of the country. Now, one other reason why this happens is because of the apparent movement of the sun towards the north. So in these months, we have the largest amount of sunshine that occurs in our country. Now, when you have most of India which is warming up, so if most of this portion is warming up, then what do we expect? We will expect that there will be a low pressure that gets created here. Why? Because once you have a land mass that is getting heated and it is not surrounded by the seas, it does not lie close to the seas. So in this case, the air will become warmer, it will become lighter, and it will rise upwards. And so in these areas, we will get low pressure. So in the hot weather season, we start to get a low pressure build up in most of North India. Next, we have the southwest monsoon season from June to September. Now, when we have low pressure that is created over most of India, then winds will rush to take its place. And in our country, these winds are the southwest monsoons. So they move from southwest towards northeast. Now, when these winds move to take the space that is created by the low pressure zone, in that case, the winds will enter into our country from the south. And so typically, South India experiences monsoons before North India. So this is the second season, the southwest monsoon season, where we get southwest winds which bring the rains, and these are known as monsoon winds. The term monsoon is derived from the word mausam, which means season. So these are seasonal winds, and you can think of these as a very large scale sea breeze that is coming into the country because the land has been heated up a lot. And these winds, because they are coming from the seas, if you look at this portion here, we have the Arabian Sea, and in the summer seasons you have high temperatures here, so the winds that move over these waters, they carry with them a lot of moisture. So these are moisture bringing winds, and they cause an intense amount of rainfall all over the country. So South India experiences the season before North India, but essentially these winds traverse all of the country. And in those regions where they get mountains that are aligned adequately, you'll get an intense amount of rainfall. So you'll have rainfall here, you'll have rainfall here, you'll have rainfall here. And in those areas where you do not have mountains that are suitably arranged, the amount of rains will be less. The third season is the retreating monsoon season, which is from October to November. Now, in this period from October to November, we start to observe that the sun is now moving apparently to the south of the earth. Because of the tilt of the earth and because of the change of the season, now we have an apparent movement towards the south. So earlier, the northern portions of the country, they were getting heated up. But now with the sun moving towards the south, now they are becoming cooler. And in this period, the zone of low pressure, it is shifting. It is now no longer over northern India. And once that happens, then the winds change their direction and the monsoons retreat from the country. The fourth season is the cold weather season from November to February in North India. And South India has a more equable climate but may receive some winter rains in the eastern coast. So this is the cold weather season. So let us now understand these seasons by looking at the monthly distribution of pressure in our country. Now, in this chart, we can observe that in the month of February, so this is 27th of February, meaning that we are looking at the beginning of March. So this is the end of the cold weather season and we are entering into the hot weather season. So this is, you can say that this is the beginning of the hot weather season. Now in the beginning of the hot weather season, we have the minimum pressures which are located here. So they are very much away from the country and they are near to the equator. So near to the equator you have low pressures, but in our country we have a high pressure zone. There is a low pressure that has been developed in, say, in these regions which are in China, but in most of our country we have a high pressure. Now if you look at the wind directions, we can observe that in the eastern portions of the country there is a strong wind that is moving from the northwest to the southeast. In the western portions of the country we have the winds that are blowing from the west to the east. In the southern portions of the country we have winds that are moving from northeast to southwest, and towards the very south you have mostly in a wind that is moving from east to west. So this is the pressure and wind situation in the month of February. Then in the month of March, now you can observe that there is slight change in the pressure distribution. The isobars are also shifting. So now the low pressure zone is moving towards the north. So this is 19th of March, this is 29th of March, 8th of April, 18th of April, 28th of April, 8th of May, 18th of May, 28th of May. So when we talk about 28th of May, we are now talking about the beginning of the southwest monsoon season. So in all of these months from March to June, we observed that there is a high pressure in India and slowly we are moving towards low pressures. So by 28th of May, you observe that some portions are now having a low pressure because of heating over all of these months. This is 7th of June, then 17th of June, 27th of June. Now this is nearly the monsoon season. Now in this period you can observe that the wind directions, because you have a low pressure that has been generated in this portion, so now the winds are moving from the southwest portion to the northeast portion. So now we are observing and if you look at the size of these arrows, then you can find that this is a very high speed wind. So now you have high speed winds that are moving into the country, and these winds, they enter into the country like this, they turn in this direction, and now they are roughly traversing the whole of the country. Now this is July, this is 1st of August. Now in this season you can observe that on the windward side of the Western Ghats you have a very high speed wind that is clashing with the Western Ghats, but towards the east the wind speeds reduce. Now this is the season of the retreating monsoons. Now the low pressure zones that were earlier in most of India, especially in the eastern portion, now they are retreating away from the country. So now when we talk about this is the 12th of July, and with increasing time we are observing that they are now moving back southwards. Now this is because of the apparent movement of the sun towards the south. Now in the months of October and November, or let us look at this one. So this is the 10th of October. Now in this time we are observing that now most of India is already a high pressure zone, and now the winds are moving from the land towards the water, which means that these winds are now no longer carrying water, they are now dry winds. And so in this retreating monsoon season, we find that there is hardly any rainfall, and this continues. So on so this curve on 20th of October, most of these winds are now from the northeast to the southwest directions. Now when these winds, when they move over the Bay of Bengal, then they may result in slight amount of rainfall here in the southern portions of the country, because they are still the rain bearing winds. So we get a slight amount of rainfall in the winter months, but in most of the country we are now having a high pressure zone, because most of the land is cold. And when you have a cold land, when you have cold air, then this air being denser, it stays close to the ground and it creates a high pressure zone. So in the winter months, we have a situation where the winds are moving away from India, and so they are moving from land into water, and so they are now no longer rain bearing winds. So this is 29th of December. Now as January progresses, we enter into February. So now the low pressure zone is now close to the equator. So this is now 17th of February. So this is how the winds and the air pressures change with different seasons over India. Now when these winds are moisture bearing winds, we get rainfall. So what is the distribution of rainfall? In the month of March, we have very slight amount of rainfall, some sporadic rainfalls in some portions of the country. Then in April, again you have only sporadic rainfalls. In May, you'll start to get some good amount of rains in the southern portion of the country, because now the winds are moving into the country. So this is now the beginning of the monsoon season, and so you'll start to get some amount of pre-monsoon showers. Then in the month of June, you get a heavy amount of rainfall. So this blue color is now showing that the amount of rains have increased. In the month of July, you have a heavy amount of rainfall in most of the country. But if you look at this portion, if you look at the Western Ghats, the western edge of the Western Ghats, you have a very heavy amount of rainfall. Similarly, in the northeast portion of the country, you have a very heavy amount of rainfall. So this is August, this is September, this is October, this is November. Now in the months of November and December, you'll find that the eastern coast receives some amount of rainfall. Now this rainfall is coming from the retreating monsoons. The retreating monsoons are moving from the northeast to the southwest direction. But as they cross over the Bay of Bengal, they pick up moisture, and so they cause some amount of rainfall in the eastern coast because of the Eastern Ghats. But this is a very small amount of rainfall. Now in the month of December as well, you get slight amount of rainfalls. So these are the winter rains. Now this is December, January, February. So this is how the rains move through the country. We get an intense amount of rainfall in the months of July and August in most of the country, especially the Western Ghats, the northeastern portions, and most of central India, and also most of northern portions of the country. In all of these charts, you observe that we have very slight amount of rainfall in the state of Rajasthan. So let us now concentrate on Rajasthan. This is the area of the Thar Desert. So this is March, April, May, June, July. So in the month of July, you are getting slight amount of rainfall here. August, September, now it has again become dry. October, November, December, January, February. So in the areas of Rajasthan where we have the Thar Desert, there is a very less amount of rainfall, but over most of the country we get intense rainfall in the months of June, July and August. In the winter months, we get some amount of rainfall on the eastern coast, but not much over the rest of the country. So this is the monthly distribution of rainfall. The variations in temperature and precipitation result in different climates in different areas. And we can make sense of the climate by following a system of classification. One of the most common or widely used climate classification systems is the Köppen classification given by a Russian-German climatologist. Now, in this classification, we have 5 main climates which are represented by capital letters. Now, A refers to an equatorial climate. Now, when you talk about equatorial climate, you can think about areas that are near the equator. Now, near the equator, you have abundant amount of sunshine, and these areas have a surplus of energy. So, all the seasons or all the months of the year, they have a warm climate. There is no cold season. Plus, the amount of precipitation is also typically on the higher side. Because in most of the areas, because of intense heating, you will have convectional currents and you will have an intense convectional rainfall on most of the days. So typically the days around noon or around say 2 or 3 o'clock, it's very hot, creating a low pressure zone. The air moves up, then it cools, condenses, forms cloud, and in the evenings you have a very heavy amount of downpour accompanied by thunder and lightning. So that is the equatorial climate. All the months very warm and with a good amount of precipitation. E refers to the polar climate. Now, if you consider the areas near the poles, you will find that there is a deficit of energy at all times. So all the months are cold months. So these are two contrasting climates, equatorial versus polar. Then B refers to arid climates. Now in the case of arid climates, we are not that much interested in the temperature profile. We are mostly interested in the rainfall profile. Now arid climates have a very less amount of rainfall, because of which they are very dry. So mostly you will find deserts, and these can be hot deserts or these can be cold deserts. But the prominent thing here is that you have a dry climate. Then C refers to a warm temperate climate. Warm temperate means that you do not have any season that is very hot, you do not have any season that is very cold, so it's a temperate sort of a climate. But this is warm temperate, meaning that it is towards the warmer side, and there is no a month where you have an average temperature that is say less than -3 degrees. So this is the warm temperate climate. Warm temperate, snow or continental, and polar. Then the Köppen classification subdivides all of these climates on the basis of precipitation. On the basis of precipitation, we have 6 different subcategories. Capital W stands for desert. Now desert, as we know, is a very dry area. So this has very less amount of precipitation in any season. So you can say that this is a fully dry subclassification in which there is no month where you get a substantial amount of rainfall. Next we have capital S, which is a steppe sort of a precipitation. Now steppes are grasslands, and steppe precipitation refers to an area that is semi-arid. So it is not dry enough to become a desert, but it is not wet enough to become a forest. So this is a mostly dry area, but it supports some amount of vegetation in the form of grasslands. Then we have small f, which refers to fully humid areas. So fully humid means that in most of the months you have a substantial amount of rainfall. So this is similar to what we have in the case of equatorial rainforest. In every month you have a substantial amount of rainfall. So that is fully humid. Then we have small s, which is summer dry. So the summers are dry, but in the winters you get a substantial amount of precipitation. So you have summer dry and you also have winter dry. Now in the winter dry areas you have dry winters but moist summers. And small m refers to monsoonal precipitation, which is the precipitation that is governed by monsoon winds. So there is a reversal in the wind direction, and in some season you have an intense amount of rainfall, and in some other season you have a deficit of rainfall. So in the case of M areas, the primary determinant of the climate is the monsoonal winds. So that is the second level of classification. Next, Köppen also divides the areas on the basis of the temperatures. So in this case, we have these 8 different temperature classifications. H and K are used in arid conditions. So basically, we are talking about desert conditions. H refers to hot arid, which is a hot desert, and K refers to cold arid, which is a cold desert. Now, hot deserts such as our Thar desert or the Sahara desert, they are hot areas with very little amount of rainfall and essentially dry areas. Cold deserts such as the Gobi desert or the Taklamakan desert, these deserts are typically in very cold areas, but they are also extremely dry. So the common factor is dryness, but you can have hot conditions or you can have cold conditions. A, B, C and D are used to denote the summer conditions. So A refers to a hot summer, B refers to a warm summer, C refers to a cool summer, and D refers to an extremely continental type of summers. So essentially, in the case of A, you will have summers that are very hot. In B, the summers are not that hot. So there are temperature cutoffs that determine whether it's A, B or C. But for the purpose of this course, it is only essential to note that there are different classifications on the basis of temperature. C is a cool summer, so it is warmer than the winter, but it is still cool. And D is extremely continental, which means that it is very hot summer and very cold winters together. F refers to polar frost, which means that these areas are always under ice. They are permafrost areas. So things such as the ice caps. If you talk about, say, Antarctica, Antarctica is a polar frost area. In our country, some areas that are under glaciers, such as the Siachen glacier, they will come under such a category. We also have polar tundra, which is again a polar sort of a climate, but still there are certain seasons where it becomes a bit cooler and not that cold. So these are the 8 temperature classifications in Köppen classification. And if you look at India, we find that different areas have different sorts of climates on the basis of this Köppen classification. Now, if you look at the period 1901 to 1925, so let us zoom in this image. So here we find that most of the portions are either A or B, and certain areas are C. Now, coming back to this slide about A, B and C, A is an equatorial climate, B is arid or dry climate, and C is a warm temperate climate. So in this case, what we are observing is that some parts are having equatorial climates, some parts are having drier climates. So you have drier climates in the case of our Thar desert and also certain portions of the peninsula. Now these portions are on the leeward side because of the Western Ghats, and so they receive lesser amount of rainfall. And there are certain portions that are temperate, and temperate regions are mostly towards the north of the country. And then you'll find certain very small portions that have the other climates. Now we find that you have S, you have W. So S is your summer dry, W is winter dry, then you have the steppe climate, and so on. The drier areas of our country have hot areas, so these are B with together with H. Now this is what the Köppen classification looks like if we consider the period 1901 to 1925. Now let us understand what is changing. Now the climate of India is changing, as is the climate of the rest of the world. We are suffering from global warming because of the enhanced amount of greenhouse gas emissions that have been done because of rampant burning of fossil fuels such as coal, petroleum and natural gas, together with the destruction of the forests. So these are the primary reasons. Now when you have a situation of climate change, what changes in the context of India? So this is the climate classification for 1901 to 1925. This is the climate classification for 1976 to 2000. So basically what you can observe is that the areas are moving towards the north. So this is 1901, this is 1976. So if you look at this portion, so this is CW. Now CW has expanded. If we look at this portion, A, that has expanded. If you look at these portions, B, and you observe that B has reduced. So this B portion is now shifting into A portion. Now this is for the period 2076 to 2100. So this is the forecasting that we can do. And in the case of this forecast, what you can observe is that most part of India becomes A. So the B has reduced. You only have these small patches and a bit of B here, but most of it has become A. So essentially what will happen in the case of climate change is that we will start to have a more equatorial sort of a climate, which is kind of expected because the climate change is being accompanied by global warming. Now in the case of global warming, we will have hot seasons in every month, which would mean that there is no month that has a cool season, similar to what we have in the case of equators these days. Similarly, if you look at rainfall, because of an increased temperature, more and more amount of water vapor will be carried in the air. So the amount of precipitation can also go up. Now when you have more amount of water vapor in the air, because the air is able to retain a greater amount of moisture at higher temperatures, what that leads to? That also leads to a positive feedback, because water vapor itself is a greenhouse gas. So when the air temperature increases because of global warming, the air retains more amount of moisture, and so global warming is further accentuated. And so we are moving towards a situation where the global warming or the climate change after a while will be lost from our control. Today if we take steps, we can still reverse the process, we can still save the planet, but if it goes beyond a point, beyond a tipping point, then perhaps we won't have any other option left. Another significance is that today in India we have a varied sort of a climate in different areas. And varied climates lead to varied habitats. So there are certain areas that are hot and they receive a lot of rainfall. There are certain areas that are more temperate and they receive a lot of rainfall. There are certain areas that are cold and they receive a lot of rainfall. Then you have certain areas that are hot but they receive a moderate amount of rainfall. Certain areas that are temperate receiving moderate amounts of rainfall. Certain areas that are cold receiving a moderate amount of rainfall. Then you have certain very hot areas that receive very less rainfall, certain temperate areas with less rainfall, certain cold areas with less rainfall. So essentially you are having a situation where different regions have a different climate. Now this climate also controls what kind of vegetation will be found in those areas. So essentially, if we have a situation where you have lots of rainfall and high temperatures, you will find an equatorial rainforest. Whereas in those areas that are very hot and do not receive sufficient rainfall, you have a desert. Now because today we have a situation where we have varied climates, we have varied habitats which support a large biodiversity. Now, in the situation of climate change, what is happening is that majority of India is now becoming similar. And once that happens, we will observe a rampant loss of habitats. So essentially, the organisms that were living here in the condition of B, now they will all be wiped out. They will be replaced by those organisms that are living in these A sort of conditions. So this is another ramification of global warming that we are observing. Now, all these differences in climate together with soil and physiography generate various natural vegetation and habitats. So there are certain areas that have soils, there are certain areas that have sand, there are certain areas that just have a rock that is there. There are certain areas that are high, there are certain areas that are low. Temperatures vary, precipitation varies, so that creates varied sorts of habitats. So what are these habitats that we observe in India today? Now this is important because in the context of climate change, we will be losing a large portion of these habitats. So let us have an overview of the major Indian habitats and their residents. On the north of the country and typically at higher altitudes, we have alpine meadows. Now alpine meadows exist in those areas that are cold. And typically these are hilly areas or mountainous areas, and the wind speed is also great in these areas. Now, if you have an area with a high wind speed, in that situation, the area will not support a very large number of trees because the trees will very easily get uprooted. So typically we find grasslands in these areas, meadows. And these are alpine because these are having a cold condition. So these are cold grasslands. And these core grasslands support a very large variety of organisms that are adapted to these areas. Different kinds of goats, different kinds of sheep, different kinds of rabbits, they occupy these areas. So these are alpine meadows. We typically find them in areas like Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and so on. This is another image. So here you can observe that there are vast grasslands. There are some trees, but not many. Next we have the alpine forests. Now alpine forests also are cold areas, but we find trees here. And the majority of the trees will be coniferous trees because these are very cold areas, and when there is snowfall, then the snow, if it is retained on top of the tree, then it can damage the tree because of its weight. So essentially most of the trees in these areas will be coniferous, which means that they have a structure that leads to the easy slippage of the snow. So snow does not stand on these trees for a very long period of time. They also produce cones, which is why they are called coniferous. So in a number of these trees, the leaves will be very small, they will be needle-like, and this is an adaptation against snow. So these are alpine forests. Then in certain drier areas, we find the deciduous forests. Now deciduous forests are those forests that have certain mechanisms to conserve moisture. Typically this mechanism is to shed their leaves in certain seasons when the water supply goes down. Now we have observed before that plants undergo transpiration, in which case water is lost from the leaves through the pores in the leaves that are known as stomata. Now in this way the water in the soil is lost into the atmosphere. Now in the case of deciduous trees, to conserve moisture, why do they need to conserve moisture? Because they are living in those areas that do not have a very large amount of moisture. So to conserve this moisture, they will shed their leaves in a particular season. So in those seasons where they have a shortage of moisture, all these leaves will be shed. So if there are no leaves, there are no leaf pores. So the water will not be lost through transpiration. Now deciduous forests are divided into two categories. We have moist deciduous forests, which are found in those areas that still have an appreciable amount of moisture. And we have the dry deciduous forests that are found in more drier areas. So moist deciduous forests, such as the Sal forest in Uttarakhand, it will also shed its leaves, but you'll find that the soil has ample amount of moisture. This is another example. This is from Tamil Nadu, and here again you have a moist deciduous forest. In the case of dry deciduous forest, you'll observe that it's a very dry condition. This is a teak forest in Madhya Pradesh. And you can observe that these trees have shed a majority of their leaves. The ground is just covered with leaves. So this is the adaptation to conserve moisture. This is another example from Panna Tiger Reserve. Now, when we talk about the deciduous forests, they support a large biodiversity. We find tigers both in Uttarakhand as well as in Madhya Pradesh. We also find tigers in Tamil Nadu or the Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. So, this is Panna Tiger Reserve. This is Mudumalai Tiger Reserve. In Mudumalai, we also find elephants. We also find elephants in Uttarakhand. So, we can observe large sized animals. We can find things like tigers and elephants. Now, these animals, they require a large area to live in. Tigers need to be supported by a large variety of herbivores. So typically we'll find animals such as cheetal and sambar, nilgai, or even the Indian bison. So these areas will have a very large amount of biodiversity, and this biodiversity is adapted to these areas. Next we have the scrub forest. Now scrub forests are found in drier areas, and in these areas the trees will be less in number and most of the vegetation will comprise of grasses or shrubs. Now this is an adaptation for less amount of moisture in these areas. So the amount of moisture is so less that it cannot support a large number of trees, and so you find smaller plants, you find grasses and you find shrubs. And these areas do support a large amount of biodiversity. Of course, of not that high as is supported by a forest, but even in these areas you can find animals such as tigers or animals such as cheetal. If you move to even more drier areas, we'll find sand dunes. So now we are moving towards Rajasthan. This image was from Ranthambore National Park. This image is from Jodhpur. Now Jodhpur is even drier. So in this case, we hardly find any vegetation. There are very less number of plants that are naturally found in this area. These trees have been planted by the forest department. So these are exotic trees that have been planted to support the sand dune, so that the sand dune does not move from one area to another area, to stabilize the sand dune. But essentially, you find very little amount of vegetation in these areas. But these areas still support a large amount of biodiversity that is especially suited for these conditions. So we find this spiny-tailed lizard in the Desert National Park, and this is not found in other areas. Now to the west of our country, we also have a large number of estuaries. So this is one from Jamnagar. Now estuaries form a very specialized habitat where you have a mixing of fresh water with salt water. Now in these areas we find a large number of marine animals, we find a large number of freshwater animals, and we also find a large number of animals that are specially adapted to living in the estuaries. So this is another habitat. This is an image from the Run of Kutch, the Indian wild ass sanctuary. Now the Indian wild ass, which is also known as khur, this animal is only found in these areas. It is endemic to these areas. Now The run of Kutch is an area that is a very flat area. It gets inundated in certain seasons, but for most of the months it is very dry. So you can observe that you have these vegetations in the form of herbs and shrubs, but not a large number of trees. In certain areas, we find these water bodies that support birds such as flamingos. So these are very specialized habitats. Now, if there is climate change and if everything becomes one and the same, we'll lose a large number of these organisms. We also have a large number of lagoons in our country. Now, lagoons again are brackish water wetland systems, meaning that they have a mixing of fresh water with salt water. They are essentially an indentation of the sea into the land. And in areas such as the Chilka Lake, we find that there is a very distinct biodiversity that is not found anywhere else. We find specialized dolphins in the Chilka Lake, which are not found anywhere else. Now, this is an image from the Brahmaputra floodplains in Assam. This is the Kaziranga National Park and Tiger Reserve. Now, in these areas, we find that there is a copious amount of rainfall. These areas suffer from floods. And when there is a flood, then the water spreads to a very large area. And when a large number of vegetation is submerged, then most of the trees die when they are submerged. And then when the water recedes back after the monsoon season, then you have a growth of grasses. And there is a very rapid, rampant growth of grasses in this area. And these grasses support a large amount of animals, a very great amount of biodiversity. So here we find animals such as elephant, tiger, but we also find rhinoceros. We find barasingas. So these are the kind of biodiversity that we find in the floodplains. This is another image, and here we can observe a rhinoceros and all these expanses that have water and the grasses. This is another example. So in most of these images, you can observe that this is a low-lying area that has lots of water, lots of grasses, and abundant biodiversity. We also have certain specialized habitats such as the Shola forests. We find Shola forests in states like Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Now in this case, these hills, and these are very old hills, they have a very unique ecosystem in the form of these grasslands. So these light colored things are the grasslands, and these forests in the form of these dark colored trees. And there is a dynamic equilibrium such that the forests do not intrude into the grasslands and the grasslands do not replace the forests. So this is the Shola forest. This is an image from Coorg, and this is one of the most specialized habitats that we have. So this is something that is not found anywhere else in the world. And the kind of plants that this area supports is also very unique. To the south, we have the equatorial forests. So this is an image from the Andamans. Now in these areas, we find very tall trees because we have lots of rainfall, lots of sunshine. So this creates a condition that can support a very large amount of tree growth. So we get very massive trees in these areas, very thick, very tall. And so the department often makes use of elephants to move these trees. So equatorial forests are a very unique ecosystem because they have a very large amount of food production that is going on. So that supports a very large number of organisms. Mangroves are another specialized ecosystems. Now mangroves are found in those areas that are coastal areas. So these trees, they have very specialized adaptations such as these roots. Now these roots keep the plant above the water. But then if you take a plant and if you submerge the roots in water, then probably the plant will die. So in this case, the roots go down and then they turn up so that there is an opening towards the air. We have specialized structures that are known as pneumatophores. These trees also support thing that is known as vivipary, which means that the next generation actually starts on the mother tree itself. When you have the seeds start uh, to grow, they germinate on the mother plant, they start to grow, and once they have reached a certain height, then they are dropped. So that there is little chance that the seed gets submerged in water, it gets rotten away, or it is taken away to other area. So we find things like vivipary, and these roots, they support a very large number of organisms such as fishes and crocodiles. These roots also play a very important role in protecting the coast because they prevent soil erosion. And at the same time, when water is rushing from the islands towards the sea, then these trees also purify the water to a certain extent. They do not permit the sediments to move into the sea. And so these are very specialized habitats. We also have oceans and seas that support a large number of marine organisms. So basically, what we can say is that because of the large latitudinal and longitudinal extent of India, because of a wide variety of geology, different physiography, we are finding different kinds of climates. And different climates support different organisms, they support different habitats. And if there is climate change, and climate change is already occurring, so when there is climate change, we have a very great risk that a large number of these habitats will be destroyed. And with the destruction of these habitats, we will lose a large number of our organisms. A number of species will go extinct. So this has very profound ramifications for conservation. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.